Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. There's one person who's hanging out in the waiting room who will join us shortly, I'm sure. My name is Nicole Kaloran. I'm the director of the Vermont Small Business Law Center and Clinic at Vermont Law and Graduate School. I'm joined today by Darshak Dholakia, who is an attorney with McDermott Will Emery, who's a firm, a National Am Law 200 firm, who is working in partnership with us to provide a little bit of educational content and to help some of our Vermont clients as well. We're pleased to have Darshak because he is the expert today. We are going to talk about tariffs. The title, of course, is Understanding Tariffs and Potential Mitigation Measures. Darshak is an expert on tariffs, and he's here to provide hopefully a simplified explanation that everybody can understand, and then discuss the current state of tariffs and try to give some clarity around all the confusion that we're hearing right now. So I'm going to hand it right over to Darshak. I will be monitoring the chat, make sure anybody who wants to drop a question in, I'll be paying attention to that. If there's anything that I think needs further explanation, I'll make sure that I jump in. We want this to be as accessible as possible, and we're going to have this on our website after the presentation, so we can so people can have this information available. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Darshak. Please take it away.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everybody. Darshak Dholakia, as Nicole said, and I'm a partner at McDermott Will Emery, based in Washington, D.C., in the National Security and International Trade Group. We have a presentation that I assume will probably be available afterwards. If you have any questions throughout, please either speak up or you can put it in the chat if you prefer. Again, we tried to keep this as simple as possible, but also try to give you all some of the nuances that are available just to both help you understand, but also help potentially, reduce the impact of the tariffs that are now affecting basically almost anyone who imports anything from any country, which is new. So again, it's understanding tariffs and potential mitigation measures. I'm going to start with just like an overview of what tariffs are and how they're typically implemented and enforced. Then I'm going to speak about the current tariff environment, which is really focusing on the actions that President Trump has sought to undertake during this year. It's been a very hot topic of conversation. And then conclude with some tariff mitigation strategies. Again, questions are welcome throughout. Otherwise, if you prefer, you can wait till the end where I've saved some time for questions as well. So with that, so what is a tariff?
We don't, Darshak, we don't have your presentation up.
Oh, you don't?
Oh, wait, it is. Sorry. No, there we go. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, my mistake.
Okay. So what is a tariff? A tariff is essentially a tax that's imposed by a government on goods that are imported into that country. They're used around the world. The U.S. is just sort of gaining the most attention right now because President Trump has introduced many, many new tariffs that are that differ significantly from past tariffs. One very important thing to note at the onset, the tariffs are paid by the importer of record. That's the company or the person that's bringing the item into the United States. If an exporter sends something from China to the United States, it is not the exporter that pays the tariff. A lot of times the news reports and some government publications will say things like, China will pay a 35% tariff on goods into the United States. That is not accurate. It is the U.S. party that is, again, crossing the border, bringing the good into the United States that pays the tariff. In general, tariffs typically increase the cost of the imported good. So that means that, if you have, and we'll go through some examples, but if you have a good that's $100 and it's subject to a 10% tariff, you've now effectively paid $110, both the purchase price plus the 10% tariff to the government in order to bring that good in. Usually, the importer, the one that's bringing the good in, they pay the additional tariff. That they always pay the additional tariff first, and then it's a question of where is that cost eventually going to lie. Sometimes the importer will just eat the cost as part of the cost of goods and services that they're using for either manufacturing or for their own consumption. If they're selling it on, if the imported good is being used to make a product or is then intended to be resold to an end customer, many cases the importer who paid the $10 to start with will then charge the end customer an additional $10. So that way the importer doesn't have to just eat the cost, and eventually it's the end customer that's paying that additional tariff. So that's why we're seeing so much concern in the news about the potential effects of these tariffs on the cost of goods in supermarkets and at Target and on Walmart. This is why, goods on Amazon cost more now because if they were manufactured abroad and are being brought into the United States. It's because, even though Target paid the additional Target tariff when it comes in, they don't want to reduce their bottom line by that much. So they're passing that cost on to the customer. So at the end of the day, it is the government is receiving the tariff payment. So this is a way for governments to make money. And that's been one of the main focuses of President Trump's tariffs is, he views it as a significant revenue generation tool, potentially, to offset some of the income tax reductions that have been done in the new tax bill. But, the economists can agree or disagree about how the net effect of that is, but that's one of the main intents. The main purposes of tariffs are here. So initially, they were really meant to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. So this is sort of coupled with the retaliate against unfair trade practices. If a company in China can make a good more cheaply than a company in the United States, they send that good to the United States at a price at which the domestic industry cannot compete. Like it costs more to make things in the United States than it does in China. So the way to sort of fix that gap is you impose a tariff on the Chinese good so that when it's brought into the United States, even if it costs, let's say the Chinese good costs $50 and the US good costs $100 to make. If you put a 200% tariff or 100% tariff on the Chinese good when it's being imported, then you have the $50 cost plus a $50 tariff. So now the Chinese good effectively costs $100, same as the US good. So people are more likely to buy US or rather than the Chinese good. If you really want to protect domestic industry, you can make the tariff even higher so that the Chinese good costs $120 compared to the US good that costs $100. So in that way, if you don't do that, then the people behind tariffs would say, no one's going to buy the US good because it's double the price. And over time, that industry will die because no one's buying the goods. So we can't afford to continue to manufacture, can't afford to compete. So tariffs are viewed as a way to sort of like offset the balance field there. I'll skip. I've mentioned two already: generating government revenue. The Customs and Border Protection. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection is the entity that is responsible for implementing tariffs. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security, and so the CBP receives the tariffs and then it remits it to the government back into the Treasury. So that's a way in which people who are paying the tariff then are effectively paying a tax to the government. It's not an income tax because it's not based on income being generated, but it is a tax by any other word. Sometimes, and I'm not going to get into the whole history of tariffs and world trade, but there's an organization called the World Trade Organization that was really set up many years ago to make sure that people who are imposing tariffs are doing it properly and for the right reasons and not going too far. Otherwise, the fear is that it could upset global trade, and at the end of the day, more free trade is better. But there are certain tariffs that are allowed even under some of these World Trade Organizations and free trade agreements that the United States has with other countries. And that is primarily for this third bullet here, to retaliate against unfair trade practices. For example, again, I'll keep picking on China because that's been the main source of the tariff consternation in recent years. The U.S. often accuses the Chinese government of subsidizing certain industries. So if it's a clothing manufacturer in China and the Chinese government is giving them a significant subsidy or reduce taxes, maybe they're providing them with discounted goods. All of that means that the Chinese entity is able to make a good more cheaply than they otherwise would because of these government practices. And then when the Chinese company takes that lower cost good and sells it to the United States, the United States view is this is unfair because we're not giving those subsidies to our companies. So therefore, on top of just the general additional cost of making things in the United States due to higher labor and higher transportation costs, et cetera, now the government of China is giving these Chinese companies effectively free money that allows them to compete even more easily against US companies. So that's really the heart of many of these tariffs historically. And then finally, encouraging domestic production, as I said, if you protect the domestic industry from foreign competition, then you give the domestic industry more space for competing. And at the end of the day, if foreign companies know that their goods are going to be continually subject to tariffs, then tariffs might encourage them to start setting up US factories, because goods that are made in the US are not subject to tariffs because they're already in the United States. They're not being imported. So that is the long-term goal of even President Trump's recent tariffs, is that if you make it so, if the foreign companies know that no one's going to be buying their goods, or fewer people are going to be buying their goods because they're so expensive due to this tariff being passed down to them, then instead, if they start making their items in the United States, it's still going to be a little bit more expensive because of all the increased costs related to manufacturing in the United States, but it won't be subject to a tariff. So if you make the tariff so high that companies say, well, this isn't worth it to make in China, if everything subject to China is going to be subject to such a high tariff that US people aren't going to buy my stuff when it comes in the United States, then maybe they'll think about building a factory in the United States instead. So there are three main types of tariffs. Ad valorem tariff is the one that is by far the one that's used most often, and this is based on a percentage of the value of the good. So in my example from before, a $100 good has a 10% tariff. That's $10 that goes to the government for the tariff. There are also specific tariffs that aren't based on values of goods, but are based on basically a unit of good. So this might not be an accurate example, but if you think about like lumber or timber being imported, rather than like the value of the timber that's being brought in, the tariff could be based on the weight of the timber, or like the per log, and that way it's not linked to the price. The commercial parties can still negotiate whatever price they have, but the tariff is set. It's going to be like $10 a pound or whatever it is. This isn't used as much. It really is the ad valorem most, but it's a possibility. It's just all the Trump tariffs have been based on values, but I just wanted to be comprehensive. Then we have a compound tariff, which can be a combination of both. That is very rare, but just wanted to give you guys the full suite of options. So to talk a little bit about what the world was like before this year. So usually US tariffs have been very targeted. It's based on specific items, and there's something called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule Code. It's put out by Customs, and it's hundreds of pages long, and it has 98 different chapters. And then within each chapter, there are subcategories. And this is basically a listing of every product that's ever been made in the world, that's ever been imported. So there's like an electronics chapter, and then within the electronics chapter, there'll be televisions. And then within televisions, there'll be cathode ray tubes, LED televisions, plasma televisions. And then sometimes even within those, they'll have subcategories, plasma televisions more than 65 inches. And then there will be a 10-digit code that's assigned to that specific item. So every time someone's importing something into the United States, they have to tell Customs what the item is. And they not only have like a word description, plasma TV, like 70-inch plasma TV, but then they'll have the code, 98, 47, whatever. That code, if you go to the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, at least historically, you could just say, okay, 70-inch plasma TVs typically have a tariff rate of 10% or 0% or whatever. So it gets very granular. And the way that these tariffs have usually worked in the past is the government will determine that the Chinese government, like the US government will determine that the Chinese government or Chinese competitors are engaging in unfair practices related to the manufacture of 70-inch plasma TVs in China. So they will go and say, this category of items, when imported from China, is subject to a tariff. So it's not just everything from China. They're really being precise about this specific item, and that's based on the code. Sometimes the government will be even more precise, and they will say, we have determined that these 3 companies in China are getting unfair subsidies from the Chinese government. So plasma TVs imported from China that are made by those 3 companies are subject to a 50% tariff. So again, it's very, very specific in the past. That's changed now, as we'll get to. But just want to sort of give you a sense of maybe why you've never had to think about tariffs before, is because they were very nuanced. They were not countrywide. They were specific items, specific codes, specific countries, and sometimes even specific exporters or manufacturers. For the people who are interested in more of like the legal background, I'm not going to dwell on it too much. These are the 3 legal authorities that have traditionally been used for tariffs. They each have, specific intent. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, that was for imports that are deemed to be a threat to national security. Section 301, this is to combat unfair trade practices. And then 701 and 731, these are specific. There's something called anti-dumping and countervailing duties that are within the tariff world, but they're kind of very like a subcategory. And anti-dumping duties are meant to offset goods that the US government views as being sold as less than fair value. And the concern there is that someone in another country might be making a good, and what they should be charging to offset the cost of making that good is $100. But they are selling it in the United States for $50. So they're taking losses on an ongoing basis. But in order to basically undercut domestic industry, the concern is that if they keep selling at 50, when no one can make it for less than 100, they're going to eventually decrease domestic competition because domestic companies can't keep up with that price. And then once the domestic industry is dead, then the foreign company is going to jack up the price because they're now the only company that makes it. So instead of selling it for the fair value of 50, they sell at 50, the fair value of 100, they sell at 50 for a number of years. And then once domestic industry is dead, they jack it up to 200. And now they're making their money and there's no competitors. So they've dumped their items at an unfair price. Anti-dumping duties are meant to offset that. Countervailing duties are meant to offset subsidies from foreign governments. So again, the Chinese government is giving a tax break to the plasma TV manufacturer. The US catches wind of it and says, well, they're getting a 10% tax break. We're going to add a 10% duty to offset that because that's not fair. Typically, historically, all of these different methodologies, reasons are public and they take a while to happen. There's time to plan. The US Commerce Department, International Trade Commission will initiate investigations. US industry and foreign exporters have time to sort of like submit data and comments about like why a tariff is or is not appropriate. Then the US public, not only the US importers, but also just the general business community can submit comments saying, we saw that this company is calling for tariffs. Here are the reasons why it's inappropriate. And then there's a formal exclusion process historically, where let's say that we determine that, I'll just keep using TVs. Plasma TVs are about to be subject to a tariff. But it turns out that there's one specific kind of plasma TV that you can't buy from anywhere else. And it's really important to hospitals or to the military. So people can say, we're not saying, we're not contesting tariffs on plasma TVs as a whole, but this one specific plasma TV is so vitally important to the US economy and can't be replicated anywhere else. So please carve that out from tariffs. And then the US government will review all these comments and then they will say, okay, we are imposing a tariff. It's a rate of X, but this specific kind that's used in hospitals is carved out. So it's a very sort of like thoughtful, logical, slow, but at least reasoned process historically. Do have a question. How often is the HTS updated to reflect the tariff rates by code? Not too often. Sometimes just because there are a lot of catch-all categories. So like within the plasma TV category or the electronics category, they'll have a category for like, electronic displays not elsewhere specified. So if your item does not fall into one of those very granular items, then you fall into this catch-all, and then that'll have its own tariff rate. So again, that's the world as it was pre-January 2025. We are now in a totally different. Yeah, it is very different now. And again, I think it's worth going through that historical process to show you how public and slow and planning, like the time for planning has been involved historically. Now, President Trump, as he said very clearly during the campaign, he views tariffs as a very important tool for U.S. policy. In President Trump's view, the countries have been taking advantage of the United States for many, many years. The United States has a trade deficit in trades of goods with almost every country. What that means is that the U.S. typically imports more from other countries than they import from the United States. So, we're buying more from the European Union than the European Union is buying from the United States. And in President Trump's view, that's not fair. There are differing opinions that it's good for U.S. Some people say it's good for U.S. companies to be able to export to other countries. It doesn't matter who's buying the goods as long as someone is. So if there's a bunch of European consumers of an item that doesn't have as much of a U.S. market, then it doesn't matter because the U.S. company is still making money. But from if your goal is to say every country should import and export the same amount to each other, then these trade deficits are real. I guess one thing to note is that there's a lot of references to trade deficits in these when you see press releases and news reports about why these tariffs are being imposed. Trade deficits, when they're mentioned in the news, are only about tangible goods, like actual goods that go into boxes and go into ships and go into planes. They do not account for electronic transmissions, like software purchases, which are just done, remotely, downloaded. And more importantly, they don't account for services. So, like for example, I'm a lawyer. When someone in Europe buys my services, that doesn't go into the trade deficit calculations. So they are paying a U.S. company money for a service, but because I'm not actually shipping them, I'm not Apple, I'm not sending a phone over. Apple's probably a bad example because they don't make those things here, but I'm not Ford. I'm not sending them a car. The car, if they bought a car from the U.S., that would help offset the U.S. deficit, but my services are not included in that. So the U.S. actually has a tremendous trade surplus in services around the world because people buy American services. It's become one of the main engines of our economy. Is we might not make things anymore, but we still do stuff. We can provide financial services, legal services, accounting services. So just a note that when you read about trade deficits, services aren't included. So it's maybe not the most accurate representation of how people are buying and selling things. Yes, Nicole.
Just a question of curiosity for me. Are there countries that do impose tariffs on services?
Not yet. It's a great question. As part of that World Trade Organization, there's this agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs of Services. And so GATS, the GATS agreement. That specifically says countries are not allowed to impose tariffs on services because the reasoning is a bit odd. I think it's basically they are so intangible that it's hard to really provide a fair value. And we want people to be able to access, the brains of people all around the world. So countries have generally agreed, okay, we're part of this agreement. There are benefits to being part of the World Trade Organization, and one of them is that you're protected. And again, historically, if you think that someone is breaking the rules that they've agreed to, if they're imposing tariffs on services that they said they wouldn't, then you can go sue them in international court. And then if you win, then they owe you money, or you can impose your own tariffs on their services. So it's kind of I'll poke you in the eye, and then you poke me back, and then the whole world goes blind as a result. But
right.
but now, I'll talk a little bit about countermeasures. There's been a lot of discussion, mainly from the EU, less so from the UK now because they were one of the early ones to agree with the trade deal with Trump. But the EU was threatening to impose tariffs on services because that's the main thing that the US exports to the European Union. And so the European Union is saying, well, if you're going to start tariffing all of our goods, the only way we can really make that even is by tariff your services. Another way to do it is a lot of countries are talking about digital taxes. So it's the same in a way. If you're charging, if Twitter is charging a fee for someone to become a verified user, those traditionally aren't taxed, but some countries are threatening to do so because there's so many digital services being provided from the United States too. So again, it's a great question. It's once that Pandora's box is open, things are going to get even messier. But at least for now, services remain off limits, and we're strictly talking about tariffs on tangible goods.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
We have a bit of an interesting question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can tackle that or if we want to tackle it. How would
sure.
one accumulate the facts to determine if countries have been taking advantage of the U.S.?
Sure. It's a good question. I'm not going to offer any like sort of like personal opinions during this, but one way to look at it is to see, okay, what are the trade deficits? What are they selling to us, and what are we selling to them? For things that they are selling to us, are we putting a tariff on or not? Like if we're having, mangoes from India, are we putting a tariff on that because that's a big export of India to the United States? And if we're not, are they putting tariffs on our stuff when we try to sell to them? So, like, for example, U.S. cars are subject to Indian tariffs, but Indian cars are not historically subject to U.S. tariffs. So if you kind of start looking first on a broad base and then kind of on a sector specific basis, like, are they treating us differently than we're treating them is basically the core of it. And if they are restricting market access, so that's another trade barrier is some countries say, okay, we'll allow US cars without a tariff, but we're only going to allow 10,000 cars for the whole year. And after that, either you pay a significant tariff or we're just not going to allow it until the next year. So that's another called barrier to trade. It's called an import quota. And so the US has one, for example, for like Canadian lumber, that there's a certain amount that's agreed to be allowed to be entered into the United States with a 0 or lower tariff. But once you start going beyond that, then they get heavily tariffed. And the idea is that the U.S. domestic industry can only do so much. Like there's a surplus need than domestic supply can provide. So that's why you have a lot of these quota systems all around the world. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying there are facts that one can point to, but sometimes the reason for those measures might be back to one of those early slides. Like maybe India just wants to protect its own domestic auto industry, and it thinks that the only way to do so is by imposing tariffs on U.S. cars. And maybe they're right. That doesn't mean the U.S. has to like it, but it's at least a reason, as opposed to just saying, like we're trying to we really don't want the U.S. to sell cars here because we don't like the way they look, or we just don't like the United States, so we don't want to support them. So there's data, and like any amount of data, it can be sort of like manipulated to fit your argument however you see fit at the end of the day. But
Thank you.
yeah, I think
It's a tough question.
it is, yeah, trying to be diplomatic here.
Thanks, Cameron.
But I do think that, like, regardless of your view of like whether these tariffs that Trump is imposing are effective or have well reasoned or not, I think what a lot of us have learned is that there are actually a lot of countries that have been imposing tariffs on the United States, and the United States wasn't imposing tariffs on their goods. And whether that's a unfair thing that needs to be fixed or not is debatable, but it does sort of sell well in the public if you say, look, the European Union has been imposing tariffs on our cars for years, and that's just a fact. And we haven't been imposing tariffs on their cars. And not having a tariff isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of negatives, but just because you have a tariff doesn't mean that's good for the United States. Because again, like I want to buy a German car, I want to buy it as cheaply as possible. I don't want a tariff on my German car, and so if someone in Germany wants a U.S. car, they probably prefer for it to be as cheap as possible too. But the European government has said we're charging you an extra 20% on that U.S. car. And so it's still like, the consumer at the end of the day is the one that eats most of these tariffs. So just because we don't have a tariff on a country and they do, doesn't mean it's necessarily, bad for the United States. It hurts U.S. exporters to that country, but it helps U.S. importers from that country because the U.S. importer doesn't have to pay that additional tariff. So simply looking at tariff rates and whether there's differences like that's usually the argument being made in the press. But at least in my opinion, you have to look at it both from an exporter and an importer consumer view. So, I mean, as you all have probably seen, Trump loves tariffs. He first started in February and I'll talk about these different waves, but Canada, Mexico, and China were the first ones to be sort of hit with extra tariffs. In April, he announced tariffs against the rest of the world. And again, I'll go into all this. This presentation could not be more timely because these threatened rates that were going to go into effect that he announced in April, there was a pause that was announced so that countries could basically enter into trade deals with the United States. And that's to combat some of those things that I talked about for the reasons. And again, I'll talk about all this more in a little bit. But that pause is scheduled to end tomorrow. So August 1st. So April 2nd of this year was Liberation Day, when Trump announced tariffs against the entire world. Those were largely paused, not entirely, which I'll get to, but largely. And tomorrow, if a country has not entered into a trade deal with the United States, a lot higher rates are going to go into effect. So especially today, tomorrow, you're going to read a lot in the news about countries that are like scrambling to enter into trade deals because they don't want these higher tariffs to hit. So again, good job, Nicole Sage, for planning this today. I talked about all those old legal authorities, the Trade Expansion Act, et cetera. Those are sort of well established. They have processes. Again, they're public. They're run by agencies. And most of the tariffs that President Trump has announced now are under a completely new legal authority that's been around for a while but has never been used for tariffs, and that's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. IEEPA is mainly used for things like economic sanctions. So if Iran is doing something that the U.S. doesn't like, the president can use IEEPA to declare a national emergency, international emergency with respect to Iran. And then he will say, the Iranian army is now on a sanctions list and U.S. people can't do business with it. U.S. people can no longer send advanced machinery to Iran because we think they're using it for military or nuclear purposes. It's been for sort of true foreign policy emergencies. And again, this is an act that Congress passed many years ago that gives the president tremendous authority to impose restrictions on interstate commerce if the president views that there is a sufficient international emergency to justify those actions. So again, there are 30 or 40 different sanctions programs that are under IEEPA. These are Iran, Russia, China, Syria until recently, and then there are also non-country specific bases where there's a global terrorist sanctions program. These are all under IEEPA. And the unique part about IEEPA is that the president, or whoever he designates, usually the Secretary of Treasury, has tremendous power to just do whatever they want without any warning. And then the idea is that by giving the executive branch that type of tremendous flexibility, they can basically coerce changes in foreign behavior. Because Iran might say, oh God, we're now on the sanctions list. U.S. people won't sell us anything anymore. We better change our act so that we can get back in the U.S. good graces. And once the president is satisfied that they've changed their behavior enough, he or one day she can then remove those sanctions at the stroke of a pen. You don't have to go through Congress. There's no sort of long convoluted process. So it's very much sort of a stick and carrot approach where I'm going to keep beating you until you change. But if you change, I'm going to immediately be able to lift the sanctions. So again, that's IEEPA, traditionally used for sanctions. President Trump used it for the first time ever. No one's ever used this for tariffs. And I'll tell you the reasons for each of them now. But the effect of it is that there's no notice or comment period like there is traditionally. U.S. industry, the U.S. public, foreign exporters. There's no formal process by which they can say, hey, these tariffs are unfair, or please carve these products out because we don't make them in the United States and we really need them. Those are all hallmarks of traditional tariffs. And the benefit for President Trump of IEEPA is that he can set whatever tariff he wants for whatever national emergency he declares. And then he can also change those rates without having to go through any process, as opposed to someone saying, hey, like the softwood lumber, like the lumber that's been subject to tariffs from Canada historically, we don't think these tariffs are high enough. Here's all the data. The Commerce Department can take it and say, okay, we agree. We're now going to increase it by 5% to offset this thing that we missed before. President Trump can just say, I don't like what Brazil is doing. I'm going to hit them with a 50% tariff. I don't need any data. I don't need any reasons other than to say this is a national emergency of global trade. So again, it's tremendous flexibility. Just a note that some of you may have seen that there have been a lot of challenges in US courts to these tariffs. And what those challenges are really focused on is saying that this use of IEEPA to impose all these new tariffs is unconstitutional, and it goes beyond what the law is really meant to regulate. And so I guess let me talk a little bit about the reasons that Trump has imposed each of these, and then I can talk about what the court challenges are doing. So there are three general categories of Trump tariffs. The first one are fentanyl related. So you may recall back in January, February, President Trump was very focused on stopping the inflow of fentanyl and to a lesser extent illegal immigrants into the United States. And he blamed our border, our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, for allowing fentanyl to cross, like that they weren't doing enough to fight to stop that. And so he imposed a tariff of 25% on imports from Canada, 25% on imports from Mexico, and 20% on imports from China, because he said, China's also responsible, but I guess for whatever reason, he said they get a lower rate. Again, this was done under IEEPA. There are various exceptions to each of these, but I'm just sort of speaking in broad terms, and I'll get into some of the exceptions later. So the fentanyl-related tariffs only target three countries: Canada, Mexico, and China. Then on April 2nd, Liberation Day, President Trump announced reciprocal tariffs. And so the national emergency for the first one, fentanyl, was that the inflow of fentanyl from these countries is posing a threat to the United States. It's an international emergency. That's my justification for using IEEPA to now impose tariffs on those countries. Fentanyl is not coming in from all over the world, and so that's not a sufficient basis for imposing tariffs on other countries. So what President Trump said is, I'm declaring an international emergency because of trade imbalances that the U.S. has with every country in the world. Either they have a trade deficit, either we have a trade deficit with them, or they're restricting market access. They're just not playing fair on the global trade world. So his national emergency there was basically the threat to the national economy by other countries not engaging in fair trade with the United States. Also done under IEEPA. And the reciprocal tariffs are the ones that are scheduled to come back in place tomorrow. These were announced in April. President Trump had a press conference in the Rose Garden where he held up billboards that basically said, these are the rates that all these countries are going to be subject to. And they're different. There's like 70 countries that have a specifically assigned rate. And then every other country is subject to what's called a baseline rate of 10%. So that means that there is currently a 10% tariff on goods from every single country, even if they're not sort of specifically targeted out. And then as of August 1st, if that country hasn't agreed to a deal with the United States, that rate could increase to potentially significant ones. I think the highest one is like 60% or something like that. So President Trump paused those reciprocal tariffs from coming into effect until tomorrow, so that countries could come and say, we're sorry for all the past imbalances that we've had. In exchange for a lower rate than what you're threatening, we are going to commit to buying X amount of American goods. We're going to invest a certain amount in the US economy. We're going to remove certain tariffs. There's all these different, there's no like rubric that is set, like that President Trump typically isn't demanding sort of like specific concessions from each country, at least not publicly. That's up to like the US trade representative to go and negotiate what the perceived imbalance is. But again, those are the two main categories, fentanyl and reciprocal. And then President Trump has also really supercharged some of these more historical investigations and categories. which are sector and industry specific. So there is currently, there has been under President Trump's first term, a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum products from other countries. And this is really, like, of the reasons that we've talked about before, this is really to protect the U.S. domestic steel and aluminum industry, is because the U.S. steel just can't compete at the same cost as these foreign imports. So in order to offset and provide a little buffer for domestic industry, steel and aluminum imports have historically been subject to a 25% tariff. President Trump recently increased that to a 50% tariff. So now if you're trying to get a steel bar from China, 10 years ago, you would have just paid the cost of the good. 5 years ago, you would have paid a 25% more, or even a year ago, you would have been paying 25% more on that good as a tariff. And then now it's 50% more. So that's obviously hugely impactful to companies that are buying these things and importing them in the United States, because now they cost 50% more than what the baseline invoice rate is. President Trump also announced tariffs on automobiles and auto parts, again, from every country. This is not sort of specific to the Japanese car industry or the German car industry or the Chinese car industry. People who are importing foreign cars will now have to pay a 25% tariff. Also on engine blocks that are made outside the United States and are brought into the United States. There are exceptions and nuances to all of this. Like if you are buying something to then put it into a US car that's being manufactured in Alabama or somewhere, you might be able to get reductions on some of these. You might be able to be fully accepted. Just yesterday, a 25% tariff on copper was announced. And again, showing the nuance, this is basically copper products like copper wire and bars that have copper inside of it. It is not raw copper because the U.S. industry said, we need raw copper to make stuff in the United States. So if you start charging us more just to buy the supplies we need, you're indirectly, maybe it's directly, you are hurting us because we now are paying more. And if you want us to make stuff in the United States, we need to be able to buy copper from somewhere because we don't have enough copper in the United States. So that's why you see some of these carve-outs. So again, these are the ones that are mainly into effect. Steel and aluminum, 50%, automobiles and autos, 25%, copper, 25%. And there's also all these investigations that Trump has announced for semiconductor imports, timber, trucks, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and others. This is a very popular tool right now. So what that means is that President Trump is telling the Commerce Department, I think that these industries are being damaged by imports, either because of unfair trade practices or because of unfair subsidies. So I want you to go and do an investigation. And if you determine that I'm right, then you're going to impose a tariff on top. The most frustrating part, one of the frustrating parts about these tariffs is that they often stack on top of each other. And we'll go through some examples, but if you are buying Chinese steel, a Chinese steel product, then you're paying the 50% tariff on steel. You're paying the 20% fentanyl tariff as well. And you're also paying the 10% reciprocal tariff. So now all of a sudden you're paying 80% on a good because it's captured by multiple regimes. And I'll go through some examples that again are basic, but just sort of meant to show how these exposure can be so significant so quickly. And then each tariff regime has its own unique exclusions. So for the Canada and Mexico the tariffs, again, most goods are subject to a 25% tariff. But in his first term, President Trump negotiated what's called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Canada, it's called the Canada-Mexico-U.S. Agreement, and in Mexico, it's the Mexico-Canada-U.S. Agreement. It's all the USMCA is what we call it here. We used to have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's been in place for many years. And what that really intends to do is it's basically meant to guarantee duty-free treatment for goods flowing across these three countries, because the idea is that it might be a little bit easier for a car company to make the car in Mexico, just it's a little cheaper. They have all these things called maquiladoras. And so they're set up, we'll make our car there, we'll bring it back into the United States. And to avoid the consumer paying more at the end of the day, we're just going to allow duty-free flows all around. President Trump thought that NAFTA was unfair to the United States, so he basically entered into the USMCA, which is NAFTA by another name. And the main exception for the fentanyl tariffs for Mexico and Canada is that if the Canadian exporter certifies that this is a Canadian good, like we made it in Canada, we're not bringing something in from China, and sending it to the United States. It's not composed of like significantly of Chinese origin goods. Like this is Canadian maple syrup from Canadian trees. If you can prove that your good is what's called USMCA compliant, that means US Mexico Canada Agreement compliant, meaning it's made like fully or substantially in Canada or Mexico, then it's subject to a 0% tariff. No tariff at all, which is great for the importers and for the consumers. And then the question becomes, well, like, how do you know? Like someone could just say it's a Canadian good when in fact it has all these Chinese letters on it. Like that's weird. And so if you're trying to fit into one of these exceptions, which I imagine with Vermont, there's probably a lot of interest in Canadian trade. The Canadian manufacturer is supposed to be able to like provide you with the certificate of origin. That's the formal name for it. They say, we certify to you, Vermont buyer, that this good is Canadian. And that way, when you're bringing the good into the United States, because you're the importer and you're the one who's responsible for paying any tariffs, you give that piece of paper to customs, because this is all electronic, but it's a little bit easier to think about as someone crossing the border. And either you or your customs broker who's responsible for bringing this stuff in, they'll give that paper to customs and say, hey, like this is Canadian. That's what they said. And unless it's like unless like, you are lying or they're lying, that's usually good enough. And customs will say, okay, like looks good. Go ahead and bring it in. No tariff charged. So that is by far the main exception for Canada and Mexico. For the rest of the world, the reciprocal tariffs, I said rest of the world, China's included there. The only countries that are excluded from reciprocal tariffs are Canada and Mexico. China is subject to reciprocal as well. For there, it's not as easy because we don't have those types of agreements with every country. And if we say that if you can certify it was made in your country, then all of a sudden nothing's being tariffed, right? But that's special because Canada and Mexico are our neighbors. So instead, what was done is through a pretty opaque process. At the time the reciprocal tariffs were announced, there's an annex to the executive order that says these tariffs do not apply to all these goods. And in theory, these are goods that, again, the US industry really needs. And it's things like semiconductors. As I noted, there's a semiconductor separate investigation, but right now, semiconductor imports are not subject to these reciprocal tariffs. It's certain critical minerals. It's pharmaceutical products and active pharmaceutical ingredients. At the time those reciprocal tariffs were announced, it was decided that imposing these tariffs on these specific categories based on the HTS code that we talked about, these tariffs do not apply to these goods. So it's not super easy to figure out what is and is not subject to tariffs, but the way that customs tracks it is when someone puts in that HTS code in the electronic system when they're trying to bring an import, the customs system will flag like, okay, this category is or is not exempt, and then we'll sort of accordingly charge you tariffs based on that. These specific categories of exceptions are important when we start talking about tariff mitigation strategies, because if your good hasn't been subject to tariffs historically, then the classification almost doesn't matter, because whether it's 98 whatever or 97 whatever, neither one's subject to a tariff, so who really cares other than for like import tracking purposes. But now 98 whatever might be subject to a 20% tariff, but 97 is accepted. So that's why it's really important now to think about your categories and where the exceptions apply. And I'll get into that a little bit more.
We had a comment in the chat about, it was just announced that there'll be a pause on higher tariffs on Mexico for another 90 days. And you might be getting to this, but the USMCA is being messed with to a certain extent because we're imposing tariffs on Mexico now. And so can you explain that? Or is that part of your feature, the rest of your presentation?
No, it might be, but may as well talk about it now. So same thing with Canada. Again, they're subject to this 25% tariff. This pause on higher tariffs is because the US has threatened to go even higher. They say, okay, Canada, like you're still not doing enough. Mexico, you're not doing enough. We're now bumping that 25 to 35. And that's been the threat, is that we're going to put a 35% tariff on Canada, Mexico goods. I don't want to say the existential threat, but what a lot of clients are concerned with is, they're very happy with this USMCA exclusion for 0% goods that are made in Canada and Mexico. But when these tariffs were first announced, it wasn't clear that there would be that exclusion. It seemed like everything coming in from Canada would be subject to a 25% tariff. And that was really scary for people. And also, directly in violation of the USMCA, where, Nicole, we promised we wouldn't be imposing tariffs.
Yeah.
There are still some exceptions, like if we think that something is justifiable for national security purposes, then the USMCA does have a little bit of flexibility there.
Mm.
But you can't say that every single good poses a threat to national security. You'd have to be like these specific goods.
Mm.
So in addition to saying that this pause is helpful because we know it's not going to be more than 25%, and we also are pretty sure that that means that at least for the 90-day pause, this USMCA exemption will remain in place too. But if Trump wants, he can say, okay, the Prime Minister of Canada really has angered me today. I'm doing away with the exclusion. I'm raising the tariff rate. If you think this violates the agreement, come sue me. But in the meantime, everyone's going to be paying these tariffs. And these trade disputes are super slow. They're very, very slow moving. And while they're being sort of litigated, people are paying these tariffs, right? So it's not like there's an automatic pause on everything just because someone is sued. The general default is we're going to keep collecting tariffs. And if it turns out that we were wrong, then maybe you'll get your money back, or maybe the other country will sort of like charge the U.S. something directly. But it's not automatic that if someone determines that these tariffs are illegal, that everyone who's paid a tariff just gets it back. That's not necessarily the outcome, and that goes back to the court challenges. So as soon as these tariffs were starting to be imposed, like small businesses, as well as other countries, as well as some industry groups, filed suit against the Trump administration, saying you can't do this. Like this is not what IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was meant to control. Like you are exceeding your authority under IEPA. That is the core argument of all of these court cases. Is that like we're not saying that tariffs as a whole are bad or wrong or illegal, but we're saying the way in which President Trump imposed these IEPA tariffs, these fentanyl and reciprocal tariffs, that's illegal. And so there was a case that went to the Court of International Trade. The Court of International Trade said, we agree. We think Trump has exceeded his authority under under this law. While there may be a fentanyl crisis in the United States, imposing these tariffs against Canada and Mexico is not the right method to address those. While it's true that there may be a trade deficit, that's not an international emergency under the law, and these tariffs are not the appropriate method to combat a national emergency, which actually isn't even a national emergency under the law. That's what the court said. And then the Trump administration appealed it and went up to the Court of Federal Appeals. And the Court of Federal Appeals said, well, the CIT, the Court of International Trade, may or may not be right, but they can't just stop these tariffs. So the Court of International Trade ordered that the tariffs basically had to be stopped within 14 days of the decision. And during that 14 days, the Trump administration appealed, and the Court of Federal Appeals said, okay, they may or may not be right, but we generally defer to the executive, and we have to actually let this court be fully litigated. Let this case be fully litigated with all the facts and responses and briefs and everything. And because this is so important, we're reinstating the tariffs. Even if they may end up to be illegal, we're saying that Trump actually can exercise this authority for now until it is formally determined by the full court that he cannot, or that it's illegal. So there were 3 days when everyone was so happy that the tariffs were going away. And then immediately they were sort of put back in place. And now that case is proceeding not particularly quickly. If and when a decision comes out, it'll almost certainly be appealed. It's almost certain to go to the Supreme Court at some point. And then, we'll see what happens then. But all that means is while you may have seen some reports of successful court challenges, right now everything remains in place as it was intended by Trump. And maybe one day there'll be a reprieve, but for now it's in force. So these court cases don't really matter much. I want to talk a little bit about China and Canada, Mexico specifically, just because that's it's indicative of how a lot of these tariffs work, but also they're kind of the main exporters to the United States. So currently, again, tomorrow, unless someone has agreed to a trade deal, a higher rate will go into effect. There was a crazy period of time during March and April where President Trump was just adjusting the tariffs on China himself, usually by social media. And at one point, there was a 145% tariff on every good being imported from China. That was only the case for like a week, but companies that were importing goods from China during that week were getting hit with these ridiculous tariff bills. And you had to pay them if you wanted the goods to be released by customs to come into the United States. Cooler heads eventually prevailed. There was like a pause on the higher tariffs, and now the U.S. and China have agreed on like a framework trade deal that the details are still being negotiated. But what it means is that at least for the near future, there's typically a 30% tariff on most goods being imported from China. And I know that I'm being kind of like specific with the numbers here, but I do think it's helpful just because these are real numbers that end up being on your bill if you're importing anything. So I just want you to sort of like understand where they came from and how they might change. So again, apologies if this gets like too specific, but the only way to sort of explain the effect of some of these is by being specific with examples. So that 30% on China, it's that 10% reciprocal rate that applies to the entire world. And it's also that 20% fentanyl rate that is due to China not doing enough to stop fentanyl exports. So then that's how we get to 30. That reciprocal rate is the one that can be adjusted pretty high. That's where basically it went up to 125%, which 125 plus 20 gets you to 145%, which was the high water mark. So right now it's 30 for the near future. There was this thing that existed before called a de minimis exemption. So what that meant is that if you're importing a good from China and it's less than $800, you don't have to pay a tariff on that, because the idea is that these small shipments, they almost certainly are for personal consumption by U.S. people. They're not large inputs into manufacturing. They're not threatening U.S. industry because I don't know if you guys are familiar. There are these apps called like Temu and Wish. There's one that's for clothing that my wife used to use. But these are all very like low-cost Chinese goods where you can go on, you can buy a pair of pants for $6 and it comes from some Chinese warehouse. Because your import was less than $800, you traditionally weren't paying tariffs on those low goods. President Trump eliminated that exemption. So now all of these sort of like low-cost suppliers, when you import that good, you have to pay the full 30% rate. He's so far only removed it for China. If you're buying goods from other countries and they would otherwise be subject to a tariff, this de minimis exception still exists. But the removal of that exemption it hit the American public pretty hard because the big level tariffs, those will eventually be passed down in the form of higher cost of goods, or like you're going to the supermarket and things cost more. But now it's the things that you were ordering from these websites, the things from Amazon, all of those are now subject to tariff if they come from China. So that was a pretty major point that Trump closed that still exists for the rest of the world. And under Trump's first term, I talked about 301, which was Section 301 tariffs, which was like historical, well-precedented. Those are meant to combat unfair trade practices. We heard a lot about sort of like Trump's tariffs on China under the first term, but that was not a blanket tariff on everything coming in from China. Those were specific to goods. And so he would say, Chinese lab equipment is subject to a 25% tariff because I've determined that these categories of items are improperly being subsidized by the Chinese government. So there's a whole bunch of Section 301 determinations against Chinese products. But it's not a blanket, everything Chinese is subject to tariff. So those 301 tariffs still remain in place, and they're added on top of things. So if you're buying a good, if you're importing a good from China that's subject to one of these 301 tariffs, again, there's a lot of them, then you're paying the 10% reciprocal, the 20% fentanyl, and the 25% 301 tariff as well. So it's a total of 55% tariff on what you're importing. They have entered into this deal. They're negotiating the framework. The most likely outcome, and I'm not a betting man when it comes to these things, so take this with a heavy grain of salt. But what will probably happen is the 10% reciprocal rate will stay in place. The 20% fentanyl rate will probably stay in place as well. But China's arguing that it should be reduced. So we might see some changes in that. It's not going to go to a zero rate. Like there will be some rate on Chinese tariffs. There will be a Chinese tariff rates that will affect all Chinese imports, in addition to maybe these sort of good specific ones. But this is probably what it is now is probably what it will be 6 months from now. Again, for as much faith you can put in predictions. But yeah, we'll see. There's negotiations. So for Canada and Mexico, I've sort of talked about this already, but the tariffs are really only imposed right now for fentanyl and for Mexico illegal immigration reasons. They're subject to this 25% tariff right now. They're not subject to the additional 10% reciprocal tariff. There are certain subgroups. So if you're buying certain energy products like Canadian refined oil products, those are only subject to a 10% tariff. They're not subject to the higher percent at 25%. So that 10% is not on top of anything. It's just a 10%. Potash from Canada as well, because it's important input into U.S. fertilizer and other industrial products. That's also only subject to a 10%. As I mentioned, this current exception for goods that are compliant with the USMCA. Trump has threatened tariffs of 35% against Canada. Should have put Mexico in here as well. As it was noted earlier, like those are now on pause as people negotiate. But just again, putting on my prognosticator hat, things don't seem to be going very well with U.S.-Canada negotiations. So it's possible that Canada gets subject to a higher rate. Mexico hasn't really done much. One thing that the U.S. really doesn't like, and wanted to cover this a little bit, is a lot of these countries, when the U.S. has imposed these tariffs on them, they say, well, that's not fair. We're going to impose tariffs on you. So they're called countermeasures. So Canada, as soon as Trump announced that these Canadian tariffs would come into place, they put up a list of goods. They say, if the U.S. goes forward with these tariffs, we are going to impose a 25% tariffs on these specific goods. So unlike the US, they were not going to impose a 25% tariff on all US imports. They put like a list of goods out there. And the way it was crafted is that they were really targeting goods that originate in states with Republican governors. And so the idea was that if we start taxing Tennessee whiskey or goods that are made in Florida, then maybe those Republicans will be able to go to President Trump and say, hey, like this is not a good idea. So the list is very odd in many ways. It's not just sort of like goods that Canada thinks are better made in Canada than the U.S. It's the reasoning behind it is to sort of exert political pressure to get Trump to change his mind. Whether or not that would ever work is your own determination, but that was the intent. So Canada had that is Canada's countermeasure, is they have a list. They are imposing tariffs on these goods because the U.S. is imposing 25% tariffs on Canada. There was a second list. I forgot what the initial. There were maybe like $20 billion of goods or something targeted under the initial list, and there was an additional like 80 billion or 100 billion of goods that were supposed to come in on a second wave. And that second wave has been halted right now because of like the good faith trade negotiations. But that's potential that if things go south and the U.S. doesn't raise tariffs on Canada, then Canada could then dust off these lists and impose countermeasures on them. The EU is another one where the European Union, where Trump had threatened to put, I think, a 20% tariff on European Union imports. And the European Union said, well, then we're going to start putting a 20% tariff on U.S. goods. And here's a list. Again, they're still being list-based. They are not being everything that's originating in the United States. And that was like, bourbon and certain food products and cars and steel. So again, this is the whole like where if you poke me, I'm going to poke you back. Most countries have suspended countermeasures during this negotiation phase because their rightful concern is that even though the U.S. is already charging us a 10% tariff on things, and for Canada, a 25% tariff, if we start charging tariffs on the U.S., then Trump has said, I'm going to increase tariffs for any country that retaliates against the United States. So he's basically saying, we're going to slap you with a tariff. If you respond in any way, I'm going to slap you with more tariffs. And that's how the U.S.-China spat got so out of control. Is the U.S. started with this 30% tariff on China. China said, well, then we're imposing tariffs on the U.S. 30%. And the U.S. said, well, because you imposed that 30% tariff, we're charging you a 50% tariff. And then China said, well, because you charge 50, we're charging you 50. So it's kind of like a race to the bottom in many ways. And then eventually people said, well, there's no end to this. Like if you promise you're going to retaliate, then you have to retaliate. And then the other country is going to retaliate. So countries sort of saw that played out and they said, okay, we're not going to get in this game right now. But if countries don't reach trade deals, and if the US does start putting tariffs on people, on other countries that are higher than now, we might see more of these so-called countermeasures. And again, they're specific. If there's a country of interest that you have to go and see like what their specific list is. Like if you're exporting your goods to another country and you're concerned about these countermeasures, most countries don't have countermeasures, but if they do, you really need to look into the details. Nicole, I know we're like a little over an hour. Should we just plow through, or should we take a break for people? You're on mute.
Yeah, I am muted. Sorry about that. I'm inclined to say let's go ahead and plow through. I think we're going at a good pace. You're about halfway through, right?
Yeah, I'm about halfway through, and the second half will probably be a little shorter.
Okay.
But okay. All right, good.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move through it. Thank you, though.
Okay. All right, so that's the tariff world now. It's complicated, but there are like numbers that you can look at. There are lists, and you can sort of calculate based on today's rate like what you are going to be paying. And a lot of this is like you tell customs what you're importing based on the category and what the country of origin is. And so I guess the point I should have made earlier is these tariffs are based on where the good itself was made according to customs rules. It's not where it's being imported from. So let's say let's say China is subject to a 50% tariff rate in the future. You can't take a Chinese good, ship it to Canada, and then bring it into the United States under a 25% Canadian tariff. The good itself is Chinese. And so regardless of what country it's coming in from, the Chinese tariff is 50% in my example. So that's the rate that has to be paid. We're starting to see more enforcement for tariff violations. And so when we start talking about what are the risks of all these tariffs, in addition to just like you have to pay more for importing goods, there's a lot of like legal and compliance risks that are associated now under this complicated regime. And the first one is that the tariffs aren't being paid properly. Either because of a misclassification of a good, like you're saying either improperly, like either knowingly or not, like, hey, my good comes in under this category, and this category just so happens to be tariff free. So I'm not going to pay a tariff in customs unless they have reasons to doubt you. There's tons of imports happening across ports every day. Like they're not opening every single box to make sure that what you say is in it is actually the case. Or if there's like a subcategory and plasma TVs are subject to tariffs, but cathode ray tube aren't, or LED TVs are not, they're not going and saying, okay, well, this description says that it's LED TV and you're telling me it's a plasma TV, like you liar. They're basically trusting you. But over time, these are all historical records. There's a 5-year statute of limitations for tariffs. So if you've done something wrong, improperly or not, you will be at risk for 5 years from the time of import that customs could say, hey, like that you didn't do that properly and you owe us more money. That's typically what the investigation is. So again, the biggest risk is an importer is not paying tariffs properly, either because they are saying there's a different country of origin, like they're saying the country of origin is Canada when in fact it's China, because they know that if they say it's Canada, they get a 0% rate, as opposed to the 30% rate from China. And there was just a case that settled, that was announced last week, where a U.S. importer of wood flooring was importing from Canada, and they were telling customs it's a Canadian product, so it was 0%. But it turned out it was actually a Chinese product, and the Chinese product was subject to one of these 301 tariffs. So it should have been subject to a 25% 301 tariff when the importer was misrepresenting that it was Canadian. And in that case, there's a lot of bad emails and bad like fake invoices where the people who were importing knew exactly what they were doing. And so they were criminally charged by the Department of Justice for tariff evasion. And as a result, significant fines and I think jail time for some individuals. So that's the risk, right? I mean, if you're knowingly misrepresenting things, there's a huge criminal risk. But even if you're just, like, I'm just a small business trying to do the right thing and I messed up, there's a risk that, you could be subject to fines and penalties, probably not jail if you weren't doing it on purpose, but additional, like not only do you have to pay the tariffs that you owed, you also have to pay like a penalty because you did it poorly, and you have to pay interest on like the time that you didn't pay the tariff. So these things can add up pretty quickly. as we'll go through, some of these are complicated calculations. It's not just, okay, it's a $100 good with the 10% tariff, so I owe you $10. It gets kind of messy. And again, as I mentioned, there's increased enforcement, DOJ for criminal violations. For those of you who are like paying attention to the legal proceedings, there's a law called the False Claims Act. And what that means is that it's traditionally been used for things like Medicare and Medicaid fraud, where a doctor would say they performed a procedure that they didn't, and the government, pays them a reimbursement for insurance for the thing that they didn't do. So that's fraud under the False Claims Act. The doctor has made a false claim to the government about money that the government owes to it. We are now seeing the False Claims Act being used in the tariff evasion context because it's money that you owed the government that you haven't paid. So you have made a false claim that your good is not subject to a tariff or is subject to a lower tariff, when in fact you have now effectively defrauded the government. So the interesting thing about the False Claims Act is it has a private litigant side. So let's say I work for a lumber company. I'm an employee. I like to do the right thing. I know that this lumber company is saying that this lumber is Canadian when in fact it's Chinese. I can bring a suit against the company to say this company is breaking the law. They are evading tariffs. And if I'm right, so in some cases the DOJ, the Department of Justice can say, hey, like look at this case, like this looks good to us, like we're gonna jump in and help you. And even if they don't, whether they do or don't, if I'm right and it turns out that the lumber company has paid $10 million less in duties than tariffs than they should have, I can get a cut of that. I can get up to 25 or 35% in some cases. So now all of a sudden, there's a lot of incentives for whistleblowers to come out, whether that's a whistleblower within your company or it's a competitor who says, the only way these people could be competing at this lower rate is because they're avoiding tariffs. So the False Claims Act has a tremendous risk of private litigants bringing cases. So you can't just say, oh, well, the government will never catch me because I'm smart and I'm doing a good job and governments are under resourced now, like whatever. It's not just up to the government whether they investigate. Now private people can expose tariff evasion, which is scary in some ways because some people are like, well, what if someone falsely brings a case and they're just trying to make life difficult? That's a risk. So we'll have to see. And then again, increased resources for Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. It was just noted in the chat, thank you, Ali, that Trump yesterday issued an executive order that whole de minimis treatment I mentioned for goods under $800, imports under $100, that's been eliminated for all countries. So, hope you got your goods in while you could. Now, unfortunately, for the American consumer, every good, even if it's small, is now going to be subject to tariffs. So thank you for that. That's useful. So again, there's a lot more risk now. I want to go through some examples of tariffs. This is a simple one. U.S. companies seeking to import clothing from China. Again, this is based on today's rates. The value of the good is $1,000. Reciprocal plus fentanyl tariff is 30%, right? 10% reciprocal, 20% fentanyl. That gets you to 30%, and 30% of 1,000 is 300. So you would be paying a $300 tariff to the U.S. government and then $1,000 to the company you bought it from. So pretty straightforward. All right, now we're getting a little bit more complicated. You want to import solar cells from China. So solar cells are subject to a Section 301 investigation that determined that Chinese solar cells are unfairly subsidized and are threatening the U.S. solar cell market. So they are subject to a 50% tariff under Section 301. And this has been in place for a while. So now you're paying the 30% reciprocal plus fentanyl tariff, which you did for the clothing. And now you're paying an additional 50% tariff because of the Section 301 investigation. So now you're paying an 80% tariff on this solar cell. So it was $1,000. You're now paying an $800 tariff, again, on top of the cost that you're paying to the exporter. So, we're talking real money here already, especially for companies that are operating under pretty thin margins for profits to start with. And then finally, slightly more complicated example. So I talked about these steel tariffs, that were increased to 50%. It used to just be focused, those tariffs just used to be focused on like industrial steel, steel bars, steel rods. What the Trump administration has done is that they have now said, okay, we think that in addition to like competing against the domestic steel industry, like, it's hard for US steel companies to make steel bars and steel rods at the same price, so we're going to put the tariff on it. We think it's unfair that companies internationally who are making products using steel, and steel is a pretty significant component of those products, and then importing those into the United States, we think that's an invasion of the steel tariffs. So what they've done is they've said not only does it include steel rods and bars, but household appliances like dishwashers, refrigerators. If those are made of foreign steel, we're going to charge you the steel tariff for the steel content in that good. And so this is where it starts getting like even more complicated. So in this example, which you guys have probably read because I was talking, US company is seeking to import a refrigerator from China, and 70% of that refrigerator is foreign steel. And 30% is, like plastic and wires and, like power generators or whatever. So when I go to import that refrigerator, customs says, okay, this is what's called a steel derivative good. So you, the importer, have to tell me, customs, how much steel is in this. And that traditionally is kind of a crazy question. Like, who cares how much it is? Like, I'm paying $1,000 for it. So, like whether it's 70% steel or 40% steel, like it doesn't matter to me, like, because I'm buying a refrigerator. I'm not buying steel, right? It just so happens that steel is being used in the manufacture of this refrigerator. Now, importers have to say the steel content of this refrigerator is 70%. And so the way it works is everything, the whole fridge is subject to the 30% tariff. So you're already paying a $300 tariff just on the fridge. And then you're paying an additional steel tariff on the steel content in that fridge. And that steel content is subject to a 50% tariff. So because 70% of the item, 70% of your $1,000 item is subject to the steel, so that's 700. And then you take that with the 50% tariff. So that $700 worth of steel is being subject to a $350 additional tariff. So the normal 30% on the whole fridge plus the 350 on the steel content. So now you're paying a tariff of $650 on top of the $1,000 that you did. And again, I know this is kind of like a lot of numbers and complicated, but like this is what every single US importer is now faced with doing every time they're making an import. So it is tremendously complicated and burdensome. If you get it wrong, there's a risk both of excess duties, but if you're doing it, if you just say, I know it's 70%, but I think I don't want to pay that much, I'm just going to say it's 20%, then you're willfully breaking the law. And the problem is, like, the vast majority of my clients, they want to do the right thing, right? They're like, just help me do what's right. Like, I may not like these tariffs, but I don't want to break the law. Like, and then so it can be very complicated, even for people who want to do the right thing, to sit here and do all these calculations. It's crazy. So again, this is probably really small on your screen, and it'll be in the PowerPoint later. But just wanted to sort of like summarize for at least like major U.S. trading partners. As of this morning, when I finalized these slides, this is the current state of play. Like this will change, but by how much depends on how many other trade deals. So again, like this column here is today's rate, and this is kind of based on either the baseline tariff, the baseline reciprocal tariff of 10%, or because for here Canada, it's either 0% for Canadian origin goods or 25% for other goods. China's subject to this 30% because it's fentanyl plus reciprocal. So as you'll see, everything here is 0 to 30%. Like most countries are 10%. And obviously, I didn't put every country in the world. These are just like countries that my clients have largely been interested in, which is why I have this data handy. This middle column is what the rate is probably going to be tomorrow. And so this is based through a combination of what Trump originally threatened in April under the reciprocal tariffs that have been paused for trade deals, and additional sort of like tweaks. Like for Brazil, I think initially they were going to be subject to just a 10 or 15% tariff under the April tariffs, but President Trump has found additional problems he has with Brazil in the interim. So now he's threatening them with the 50% tariff. Same with India. Like I think India has been 25% the whole time. But this third column is kind of like how reliable is the middle column? Because a number of countries have reached trade deals with the United States, but it is nowhere close to every single country. Like right now, it's just China, the European Union, Indonesia, Japan, Philippines. South Korea actually did yesterday, so this no should be a yes. United Kingdom and Vietnam. So again, there's only a handful of countries, including the European Union, that have entered into trade deals. And if they have entered into a trade deal, then that means this middle column is pretty reliable for now, unless people anger President Trump more. But the trade deals basically lock in this middle rate. So for Indonesia, before they reached their trade deal, they were threatened with the 20% rate. And because they had a trade deal, now it's 19. That's not great. It's not really a big reduction. But what it means is that it's not going to be 40. So it's just a good way to sort of like, at least you know what you're getting into and you can sort of lock that in. The United Kingdom was the first mover. That back in May, they sort of like properly surmised that we better get a deal quick because it's probably only going to get worse. And the United Kingdom and European Union in many ways are similar, right? They're like European allies. But UK moved first, so they're locked into a 10% rate. The European Union just agreed this week. So they got a 15% rate rather than 10%. So if they had acted more quickly or maybe given more, they would have been subject to a better rate. So again, don't take this as gospel. This is just kind of like the current state of play. But a lot of clients are trying to we're all trying to run businesses here. And I need to be able to project not just today what things cost, but 6 months from now, what are they going to cost? Because I'm setting supply agreements or I'm setting prices with customers at what prices they're going to buy my products. And so you have to sort of like look as well as you can to project into the future because you want to be as sort of like tariff proof as possible. It's just been very difficult in today's environment when you thought based in April that the macadamia nuts you're importing from Brazil, worst case, they're only going to be subject to a 10% tariff. And now it turns out they could be subject to a 50% tariff because the US and Brazil look nowhere close on a trade deal. And 50% is the highest rate of any country. So why is the US so angry at Brazil? When in fact, it turns out that Brazil is one of the few countries where we have a trade surplus. Like they actually buy more US goods than we buy Brazilian goods. But for various reasons, which you can look at later, I'm not going to go into here. President Trump views Brazil as nevertheless being unfair to the US, so he's going to hit them with the highest tariff of any country in the world, which is pretty incredible when you take a step back. So again, this is just sort of like meant to summarize how everything plays right now. So how are companies responding? And again, I know we have. I didn't think I would take the whole 2 hours, but it looks like we're going to come close because there's a lot to talk about. So what you got to do first is you got to figure out what is your exposure right now. Where are you importing goods from? What are those goods? What is the applicable tariff rate? How certain is that tariff rate to be locked in, either because there's a trade deal or because they haven't caught the attention of the president in a negative way? So it really requires like a deep look at your supply chain, where all the products are coming in, how much is international, et cetera. Then you have to okay, now that we understand what our exposure is, what can we do to reduce that? And I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. But it's sort of like, okay, what are we legally allowed to do to reduce our tariff exposure? And then once you figure that out, you got to go out and do it. You got to say, okay, like these are low-hanging fruit. We can do this. This might be more cumbersome in the long run or more expensive, but it's really the best way to avoid avoid the tariff exposure in the future. So what you really have to ask yourself when you're looking at deploying solutions is, how permanent of a solution do you want for what might just be a temporary problem? And so going all the way back to the beginning of the presentation, as I said, like one of the goals of tariffs, one of the long-term goals is to make people make stuff in the United States again, like bring back US domestic manufacturing. And one of the ways to do that is make tariffs so prohibitive that companies have no choice but to build stuff in the US, even if it costs more to do so. It's still cheaper than making it more cheaply abroad and then bringing it in to a really high tariff. We'd rather just make it in the US. Then you have to hire American people, it goes American sales taxes, et cetera. So that's the long-term goal. But what a lot of clients are saying is, okay, like I know that these tariffs are crazy and high and prohibitive, but how long are they really going to last? Because I don't want to go build a factory if I think that, like maybe the courts overturn the tariffs, or maybe President Trump says, okay, I'm bored with tariffs, so I'm going to just get rid of them. Or maybe they're just reduced to like a 10% level across the board instead of a 50% level, so it doesn't make sense to sort of like deploy those long-term manufacturing plant solutions. So I guess, each company is unique and has its own considerations. But particularly like, foreign companies that are exporting to the United States, like, they're trying to assess what they need to do, whether they need to start building plants here. And then US importers, they're trying to figure out, okay, should I be buying from somewhere else? Like, I've had this long-term relationship with my Chinese supplier. We have a great relationship, but now everything's 30% more expensive. So maybe I should go to a UK supplier of the good, or a Singapore or Vietnam supplier, because while we might not have the same relationship, there's a lower tariff. And then you have to sort of look at the cost you're going to have, plus the tariff that it's going to see like what the net payment will be. So that's kind of like a very high level of like, how companies are assessing these. And what I've spent most of my time discussing with people is, okay, how do I pay lower tariffs? You've explained the legal background very well, but I just care about paying the least amount possible because I'm trying to run a business here. So these are the main ways that you can do that. The first thing is really looking at the classification of your goods. As I said, because imports really haven't been subject to tariffs from most places historically, people haven't really had to take a close look at what the classification is. But now, because of all these exceptions that are built into various programs, the classification is super important because if you can fit into a classification that is accepted, then all of a sudden you might be paying zero tariffs when instead you're faced with a 30% tariff. So that's the first thing you got to look at is, okay, well, what are our goods being classified as now? If they fall into a tariff category right now, is there any credible way we can say, actually, it should be classified under a different category? On that note, the customs CBP has this system online called CROSS. It's the customs ruling database of some sort, a search database, CROSS. You can go there and let's say like I make jackets. I can say classification requests related to jackets, or you can just put wool jackets, and then you will see a total historical database of all the customs rulings that have involved wool jackets. They might not necessarily have one, but at least you can say, okay, well, customs has been asked a question, because what you can self-classify an item and it runs the risk of you being wrong and customs disagreeing. Or you can go to customs and you can get a formal classification, which is binding. And you can say, I think this wool jacket should be classified under HTS code, whatever, as men's jacket, meant to wear in the winter. And that might be a specific HTS code, as opposed to like wool clothing not elsewhere specified, which is what we've been using historically because we don't care. If that men's jacket category is subject to an exception, then I really want to fit into that. And if I'm not sure that customs might agree with me, like this example is pretty clean because I'm a man and I'm wearing a jacket. But if it's something that's on the margin, like there's some famous cases about like dolls that people were importing. And if you were, it's like kids' dolls. And I could be getting this backwards, but basically, if it was just a doll, it was subject to a tariff. But if it was instead classified as an action figure, which is a different category, that was not subject to tariffs. And so there was a whole like court cases and rulings about whether this plastic thing was a doll or was it an action figure. And clearly the company importing was arguing that it was an action figure, but the customs was saying, well, we don't think it's a doll. We think it's a doll because it doesn't do things that action figures should do. So some of these customs rulings are kind of ridiculous, but they have a tremendous commercial impact. So if you're thinking about reclassifying your goods, I would recommend that you go take a look at that database just to see whether someone else has successfully argued for products like yours in the past. Again, the problem is there haven't been that many tariffs historically, so the vast majority of goods have never had to be formally classified. Like the customs hasn't had to rule because it hasn't mattered. They haven't been subject to tariffs. So based on my own personal workload and based on like sort of colleagues, I know that there's a tremendous amount of requests being submitted right now where companies are afraid to take their own risk and just self-classify, or because they're working with a third party and the third party says, I don't believe you when you tell me that it would fall into this tariff-free category. Like, go get customs to formally tell us that. So they're kind of working a lot of times with their suppliers to get these classifications. If you're stuck in a category that's subject to tariffs, then you look at the value. You're like, how can I reduce the value that I'm paying? Because again, the tariff is based on what's called the transaction value, like the cost in theory of what you're paying. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. Once you've determined that a tariff has to be paid, again, the importer of record, the U.S. company that's bringing the product into the United States, they're the ones that are primarily meaning like in the first instance, they are responsible for paying the tariff. But that doesn't mean that they can't pass that cost along to someone or that they can't split it with someone. So what a lot of companies now are doing is they're going back to their contractual risk allocation. They're going back to their contracts and saying, okay, this is too much. We can't, like, we will not survive if we have to pay the full 30% tariff. So, hey, Chinese supplier, like, will you agree to give us back 15%? Like, let's split this half and half. Like, you will pay me half the tariff that I paid, and I'll just eat the cost of the other one. So that's kind of a way that, most importers are seeking to do. The problem is because, tariffs haven't really been at the forefront. Most contracts don't talk about risk allocation, and the importer is just responsible for all taxes. And taxes include tariffs. So under most contracts right now, the buyer, the purchaser, the importer, they're fully responsible for the tariffs because it's not called out some sort of like risk shifting anywhere in the contract. So as you're negotiating new contracts that will involve imports, pretty important to take a look and say, okay, we haven't thought about tariffs before, but I don't want to be solely responsible. Maybe I can try to get my exporter, my supplier to help share this. Good luck. Most exporters have been like, well, that's your problem. That's a U.S. problem. But a lot of suppliers say, okay, we recognize the importance of this issue to us. We have a long-standing relationship, or we're trying to get your business, so we're going to take some of this cost on. And that's perfectly legal. There's nothing illegal about being reimbursed for tariffs from the exporter. There's nothing illegal about saying, okay, we paid a 10% tariff, so we're going to make sure that the customer who's buying this from us pays that whole amount. It's just the importer's primarily responsible, and unless there's some sort of shift you're passing on, it's the importer that's going to have to eat the cost. And then the long run supply chain reorganization, you've been buying from China, maybe you can find a supplier who makes pretty much the same thing from a country that's subject to a lower rate. So you shift your supply chain from a country with higher tariffs to a country with lower tariffs. I'm not going to go into super detail here, but there are, under the laws, different ways to value the good being imported. So again, this is kind of the first, after you've determined you're subject to tariffs based on your classification, it's the importer's duty under the law to use reasonable care to enter, classify, and value products. So that means that you have some flexibility. Like, not all this stuff is crystal clear. As long as you think you're acting reasonably with respect to the classification and the value, then you get deference under the law. It's just that very often customs says, well, what you did was not reasonable. Any reasonable person would say this is a doll and not an action figure, so you're wrong. But at least under the law, there are 5 different methods you can use to value. The vast majority of imports are this first one, the transaction value, the price that you pay when buying the goods, right? That's what's on the invoice. That's the easiest thing to sort of like prove, the easiest thing to then impose whatever tariff there is on. Let's say that for whatever reason, the value that you're paying isn't the right price. Where this usually comes up is there's an intra-company transaction, so INTRA, so within a company, where I'm a major business mogul, I have a China subsidiary, I operate in the US as well. When I'm buying things from my Chinese subsidiary, I'm not buying the same thing, I'm not paying the same price that Joe Schmo off the street would be because, I own that company, they're my affiliate, so I get a lower price. So this transaction value is usually used when customs says that value you're paying isn't the fair value. You have to pay tariffs based on what the actual fair value of that is, which is, again, starts to get kind of crazy pretty quickly because the whole reason I'm buying from my affiliate is because I have this sort of close relationship. So what customs can say is like, okay, you're buying a wool jacket from China. You're only paying $10 for it, but everyone else who's buying these wool jackets from China is paying 50. So we think the fair value is actually 50, not the transaction value of 10. That's sort of like usually, again, used by customs to say you need to be paying something higher. But it's possible theoretically where if for whatever reason the price you're paying is actually higher than what it should be in your view, because it's sort of accounting for all these extra costs, then you might be able to say, like, this good is, I'm buying it at $100, but really the value of other similar merchandise is only 80. So for customs purposes, I'm going to say 80 is the value, even though the invoice says 100. When you're using anything other than transaction value, you should be ready to be scrutinized by customs, especially if you're, generally reporting a lower value than what you're paying. But I just wanted to show that there are other options available. If you're thinking about these, it is a very high burden to satisfy, so it's not really worth spending too much time on. But at least theoretically, there are these other options. Again, so deductive value means it's similar to like the identical similar merchandise. They're kind of comparing across similar goods. Computed value means like, okay, how much did it cost to actually make this good? Like, what's the cost of the electricity that went into the plant and the labor and the goods? So these are all sort of like lower and lower preferential. And then there's this catch-all, just because law is not law unless they have a full like mealy mouth explanation at the end. So reasonable means consistent with the principles of the previous methods. I have never seen that used, but it's at least on the books as one. But again, almost certainly the transaction value is going to be the cost where that's used to calculate tariffs. So the best way to pay a lower tariff is to negotiate a lower cost with your supplier. It's tempting sometimes to be a little cute, to say, okay, I'm paying $100 for this jacket. What if we break that apart? And you, the Chinese company, you only charge me $50 for the jacket. Then I'll pay you an extra 50 for like success fees or royalties or commission, like something that is not directly linked to what the invoice will say I'm paying for this jacket. Customs doesn't like that sort of breakup a lot of times because it's called what's an assist. So that's a technical customs term. And again, this is getting pretty technical, but I'm just like, as I'm showing you ways to mitigate, I also want to show you the risks involved in mitigating. So customs view is that the transaction value, like for customs purposes, should be reflective of everything that goes into the production process. So even if you're saying, like, even if you're telling me customs that you paid $50 for this jacket, customs knows that you're paying that exporter for like royalties and transportation, like all of which are related to how this good came to the United States. So nice try, but the actual value is actually still 100, because that's at the end of the day what you ended up paying the exporter for this jacket, cumulative of everything. So again, customs looks at all these other things. But again, transaction value is almost certainly going to be your best bet. And if you can just reasonably negotiate a lower price for your supplier, that's the best way to reduce your tariff exposure. This is getting super complicated now, but I just wanted to again show you all that could be. And again, this is what I've been spending a lot of my time on. There's this principle called the first sale method. And what that means is that it allows importers to use the price paid for the first sale of goods rather than the final sale price to determine the customs value. So this is usually a context when, I'll use China again, you're buying from a Chinese company, but that Chinese company bought it from someone else. Like, they're not the manufacturer of the item. So if it's like Chinese lumber, your Chinese entity, the Chinese party you're buying from is actually the middleman, rather than the manufacturer. And they, because they're Chinese, they paid a lot lower for that lumber to start with, because they just bought it from the company down the road in China. So they might mark it up when they send it to you, because that's how they make money. But for customs purposes, you might be able to actually use the price that they paid when they bought it from the original manufacturer. So this can be very tempting when you're dealing with sort of like an intermediary middleman. And it gets kind of complicated. So if you start trying to claim this, you got to be dead set that you're right. And the main criteria that are met here is there has to be like two bona fide sales. Like the Chinese lumber manufacturer really sold it to the foreign intermediary as a bona fide sale, and that foreign intermediary like really in a separate transaction sold it to you, the US importer. And the way that customs looks at that, so it's not just a way where like everyone's acting in a scheme and like a wink, wink, nod. We're like, yeah, I'm the intermediary and I bought this and I'm selling it to you, and you can now use that first price as the customs part. So what that means is like the intermediary, it has to be a real purchase. And what customs looks at is, okay, they'll look at the contracts and they'll say, did this middle person actually take full risk for the goods? Or was it like, did they take possession of the goods? When they were shipping it to the United States company, if the ship sank over water, would it be the initial manufacturer or the foreign intermediary who would be taking on the risk of loss? Because only if the foreign intermediary has the risk of loss can we truly say that there was a bona fide sale. So again, that's the first criteria. This is a tricky one too. Like the product had to be intended for export to the US at the time of the first sale. So it's not just a Chinese intermediary who's like has a big warehouse and they're bringing in goods from everywhere and they're shipping them all around the world. This is only the case if at the time that foreign intermediary, the Chinese intermediary, bought the lumber from their supplier, they say, hey, I'm buying this because I'm sending it to the United States. Like this is always going to be a US export. And so that's really meant to sort of get around like warehousing and inventory type activities that could otherwise take advantage of this first sale method. And then finally, it has to be the same thing. Like it has to be the same product that the Chinese intermediary bought from the Chinese supplier. It can't be, well, I bought this metal. Let's keep using lumber. Let's stick with the example. I bought Chinese lumber from the Chinese supplier. The Chinese intermediary then made it into a chair. And now I'm selling that chair to the US company. That chair is a different product than the wood, even though it still relates to the same chain. It has to be that same wood is being put on the ship and then being shipped over. You can't just like, transform or change the product that you bought. Otherwise, it doesn't qualify for this. So this is, again, relevant a lot of times for like healthcare companies or companies that might contract with someone in China to make something. It's then like put in an intermediary or bought by an intermediary and then shipped to the United States. But it does offer tremendous help for reducing import tariffs if you fit within these criteria. I'm not going to read all this. Just to the extent there's anyone who's interested in like healthcare exceptions, there is not a broad exception for like medical devices right now under any of these tariff regimes. There is an exception for pharmaceutical products, which are like drugs, but not for like wheelchairs or like other items for handicapped people. But there's this thing called the Nairobi Protocol, which sounds like a James Bourne, like a Bourne movie, Jason Bourne movie, where this is part of a statute that cannot be changed by Trump. It is on the books. It's a statute. It would have to be overturned by Congress. So regardless of what this or any other president does with respect to like these IEEPA tariffs or whatever, you can't touch these products that fall within these like. So what it means is that items that are specifically designed for blind or physically or mentally handicapped persons, they can be imported duty-free, regardless of anything else that happens. So there's a lot of case law here, as you can imagine, because a lot of people say, hey, like my product is for physically handicapped persons. And then Customs says, no, this just seems like something that anyone can use. But if you fit this criteria and your item is specifically designed for this treatment, then you can fall duty-free treatment across the board, which again is hugely impactful, especially when you're talking about those crazy China tariffs that were in place for a little while. So I have right now like multiple requests pending with Customs arguing that a client's items should fall into this category because they haven't had to look at it before. They've never used this classification because they haven't been subject to tariffs before, but now they are, so they're trying to squeeze into here. You don't have to get a formal classification, but this one's pretty risky to do on your own if you're not 100% certain. Medication is not included. We have a question from the chat. Does this like the items designed for use or benefit of mental handicap, does that include medication? It does not. It's really meant to include like insulin pumps for people with diabetes or like specially designed wheelchairs. It's like a tangible item rather than drugs, which are more covered under the pharmaceutical part. Again, pharmaceuticals are currently exempt from tariffs in general, but if they were included in here, then no drug would ever be subject to a tariff because they're all kind of designed to help sick people. It's not like sick people, it is chronically mentally or physically handicapped people. So if it's just like crutches, for example, that's not enough because that's a temporary impairment because I broke my leg. It will get better. But if there's like an implant that because I lost my leg below the knee, then I'm considered to be physically handicapped on a chronic basis, and so that fits. So I find it a little fun sometimes to try to squeeze items into these categories or not, but there's actually a lot of good like case law out there on that cross system I was talking about. So again, I don't think this is a slide that I always talk about with like healthcare conferences and healthcare clients. Obviously less relevant here, but just this is a major one that people are using to avoid tariffs. I did not say evade because evade is illegal. Avoid is legal, and you can do so. And this is my last slide, substantive. So like, what else should you be doing? So in addition to sort of like looking at everything and seeing like reducing your exposure as much, you should keep records. And again, this is kind of like the basic stuff, but important. You should make sure you're keeping accurate records because especially if you're trying to do something that reduces your tariff exposure completely legally, you want to be sure that if and when customs comes or DOJ comes knocking on your door, you have all the paperwork and all the reasoning memorialized for why you did it. It wasn't just done as a whim. It was done reasonably and properly, and here's all the documentation. If you do decide to reclassify, you should have a note to the file, or you should have a note from your lawyer, or you should go get a formal classification from customs that confirms why you are using this new classification. Because if you don't, then the risk is that customs disagrees and they accuse you of either inadvertently or like knowingly violating the law because you reclassified into something that was subject to 0 or lower duty. And then this stuff is changing all the time, like literally every day right now. And mainly it's the rates that are changing, but a lot of times what's eligible for exceptions are changing. As we learned today, like, the minimus exceptions are changing. So this is not a static moment. Like, this is just one moment in time. And if I give this presentation tomorrow, it will probably be a little bit different. So while you're planning as much as you can, you got to make sure that there's some sort of periodic checks if you do have tariff exposure, just to make sure that, like, one, you're doing things properly, but two, that you're not like missing something, that a new exception was put into a place, or a rate was reduced for one country that you have just as good of a supply relationship with as the country you're currently importing from. So it's good to just periodically check and make sure that you've got everything you needed. And with that, Nicole, I haven't seen any other questions come through. If anyone else has any questions, I still have 10 more minutes. I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully it was somewhat useful. And again, I think this presentation will be made available later.
Yeah, that's incredibly useful. I do want to pause though and see that if anybody has any questions they want to, feel free to jump on camera and ask or put them in the chat. We'll wait for a minute. I can't believe how much I learned.
Yeah,
I'm not an international trade expert, but I just learned so much. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Good. I'm glad. And I'll be curious now. Oh, great question from Katya. Any words of advice on making use of free trade zones and other spaces? So this is something I initially had in, I took out because I thought it might be too complicated, but I'm glad to know it's not. So the tariff is based on the import rate at the time the good is brought into the United States. That's kind of the basic rule. There's some nuances to that. Like if I've ordered something from China and it's already on the boat to the United States, and then the tariff rate at the time it left was 10%, but by the time it comes in, because it takes some time to get into the United States, it's going to be 50% because Trump and China are fighting again. What you typically do is you take the rate at the time that the good was loaded onto the final mode of transportation into the United States. So it would be that 10% rate. Sometimes the rates might get better over time. So let's say it's a 50% rate when it leaves. It's going to be a 50% rate at the time when I'm bringing it into the United States. But hey, like, they're negotiating. They might reach a better deal. If you're bringing a good into a free trade zone or a foreign trade zone, depending on what the nomenclature is, they're the same thing. That is not considered part of the United States. So any good that's brought into an FTZ is not subject to tariffs until it's removed from the FTZ and brought into the United States. So some companies, they have like manufacturing operations or warehousing operations within the United States in FTZs. So if I bring in a good in, I don't pay a tariff. I may never pay a tariff on it because I might just bring it in, do something to it, and then ship it right back out. It never enters the United States commerce. So for those things, it's useful to use an FTZ, a foreign or free trade zone. There's also these things called bonded warehouses that customs maintains, which are they're just warehouses, but they're under customs control. And while the goods are in a customs bonded warehouse, they're operated by not by customs, but like by third parties. Those goods have not imported. They have not been imported in the United States. It's only when they're like removed from the warehouse and brought into the borders. So a lot of times when there's like crazy fluctuations going on, and the rate that you would otherwise have to pay, if you think it might be reduced in the future, then sometimes people just park their goods in an FTZ or a warehouse just to say, I'm going to wait this out. It's like, seeking shelter from the storm. And then when the rate gets to the lowest point, only then will I actually bring it into the US. So that's a really good question, Katya.
How long before those warehouses are full?
Yeah, right. They're full and they're also not free, right? Like people
Yeah, right.
to keep them there. So yeah, last year I wish I had opened a FTZ,
Yeah,
because I'd be raking it in.
you're doing great right now.
Right.
Wow. Any other questions, folks? These are really good for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, Patty,
Patty, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This has been super helpful. I work at a manufacturer here in Northern Vermont, and I was wondering if there was a way to keep track of all of the changes. Is it really just going out to HTS every single
So
day or every week or every month or?
no, it's just it's really difficult, unfortunately. Like it is like this is my job and I don't have a good resource to do it, right? There are some, I'm not going to advertise other law firms, but there are some firms out there that put out pretty regular updates about, like tariffs are changing. If you Google something like tariff tracker, you might find some websites from other non-McDermott resources that are really useful in like sort of like saying, hey, this thing has happened, and you can't like personally curate it to like the products that you're manufacturing or your imports, but at least you can say, oh, it turns out there's a new tariff announced, and now I can go see whether that affects me. Otherwise, there's not like a government resource you can go to that says, like the business that's importing, Canadian lumber, like this is the rate today, and now we're notifying it. Like Customs and Border Protection does have these like updates that they put out, but they're pretty technical and they're not very user friendly. So I wish I could point you in the right direction for something that is super easy, but other than just like following law firm updates, there's not a good consolidated resource.
And are those typically internal or client facing updates, or are there some that are public?
There are some that are public. Yeah,
Okay,
it's just
great.
because like a lot of there are some, I do lots of other stuff in addition to tariffs. So there's some like dedicated tariff law firms out there that are like, this is the only thing they do, and they're like on top of the world right now because like they know
Yeah,
that.
this is great for them.
Right.
A.N. Derringer, says Tim Tierney.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions, folks? Again, feel free to jump on camera if you'd like Patty did, or put it in the chat. We're very happy to be able to offer this information. Thank you so much, Darshak. This is everywhere in the country. I know this isn't a question that's on everybody's minds if they're looking at importing goods, but we've had a lot of it in Vermont, and so I'm just very grateful to be able to bring you in as an expert. We do not have this local expertise in Vermont.
Yeah, no, of course, I'm happy to, and hopefully it's informative. It probably it's brought up a lot more questions, but at least now, the next time you read a news story about tariffs, you might be like, hey, like that's not actually how it works,
Yeah, there you go. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving us a news filter.
No problem.
Cool. I will mention, so if anybody is interested, I'll put in the chat. We run a program that provides free legal education and legal services to small businesses. You can send anybody here to sblc.vermontlaw.edu.
Oh yeah, sorry, I think
folks are interested.
I stopped
that's
sharing.
okay. No problem. No, you're fine. Don't worry about it. I've got the slides up there at the end of the presentation.
Yeah.
if folks are interested, feel free to send clients here or to go there if you're a small business or nonprofit yourself. We have quite a list of people, but we are able to get folks in for a closer look at educational topics, and we are also able to place folks with an attorney. We pay for up to 10 hours that the business receives, no cost to them. So hopefully that helps. And we do have a little bit of expertise if folks have a need for international trade questions to be dealt with in state. So let us know if we can help. Is there a New Hampshire equivalent for our program, Katya? Is that your question?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, there is no. I would love to be the New Hampshire equivalent. I'm actually hoping that we can expand into New Hampshire and Maine, but right now it's just Vermont.
And it's just open to Vermont businesses, right?
Vermont businesses, I've been as flexible as possible to say, well, hey, if you're interested in settling in Vermont, doing business in Vermont, having a location or having a face to your business in Vermont, I can justify providing support for you in this state. But generally, yeah, it is limited to Vermont businesses. I want to help as many people as possible. Okay, any other questions before I let everybody go? Thank you so much. I'm going to end the recording after I see if there's more questions. Okay, cool.